Hey everyone, welcome back to Citywide Blackout, your home for music, movies, and more. I'm your host, Max Bowen. In this episode, I'm chatting with author Michael Swanwick for his two newest books, The Iron Dragon's Mother and City Under the Stars. We talk a lot about world building and how the publishing business has changed since Michael first started writing in 1980. We also talk about Gardner Dozois, a longtime friend of Michael's, and the influence he had on his life and career. I'm talking to author Michael Swanwick. Crossed paths at the recent Boston Book Expo, which was absolutely an amazing experience, guys. If you don't know, now you know. Go to that thing. But Michael, thank you for joining me, and welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Now, I actually was curious, what was your Boston experience like?
Oh, I go to Boston every year because it's one of the best-run conventions in the country, and I mostly go there because there are a lot of people there I want to see, old friends I want to see and talk literature with. And so that's what my weekend is, really.
Nice, yeah. That's the way it is for me, too. I go to a lot of conventions, Comic-Cons, and festivals, but I got to say, Boston, it's such an intellectual event. Like, it's such a great chance to, meet new people, but also learn so many things about the publishing industry, about writing, about character development, plots. There's just so much you can get from the experience. So even if you don't go to like sell your work, you can just go and learn all kinds of stuff.
Oh yes.
And likewise, I definitely see a lot of familiar faces every year. It's like more and more folks that I know.
That's how it works. I remember when I was first started going to conventions when I was in my early 20s, and it was kind of a lonely thing because I knew nobody there. and now I know a great number of people, so it's much more pleasant.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's dive right into the recent news with you because you've got two big things to talk about. One is the recent release of The Iron Dragon's Mother, which, if it isn't a band name already, that should be a band name. It's a great band name, which is the continuation of a trilogy that you began about 25 years ago.
Yes.
That's a long-running series then. I'm curious as to what happened at this, you started this over two decades ago, and, now it's kind of, you're in the final edition of the series.
Well, the thing to keep in mind is I did not set out to write a trilogy,
Mm-hmm.
and this isn't a conventional trilogy in that it does not have a single set of characters or a single plot. Each book is a standalone. What they have in common is they have mechanical dragons, which are manufactured, are intelligent, and are extraordinarily evil. And they have the world that they live in, which is an industrialized version of Faerie. It all began because I was 25 years ago. I was traveling to Pittsburgh to see my in-laws, and we were in the car. I was talking with my wife, Marianne, and we were talking about fantasy, and we were talking about steam locomotives. So I made a joke about the Baldwin Steam Dragon Works, and she laughed. And about a mile down the road, I said, "Would you write that down for me?" And by the time I got to Pittsburgh, I knew I had a story there. Eventually, it took a couple of years, I wrote the novel. And the basic premise of the novel is that there's a girl named Jane. She's been stolen by the fairies and forced to work in a factory building dragons. And she escapes the factory into Faerie, and then her troubles begin.
Of course they do. Of course they do.
And really, all manner of bad things happen to Jane. And she goes from working in a factory to being in a high school, which is not an improvement, of course.
Nope.
And at the end, she's and the problem she has is she's trying to find a place in the world, but she can't find a place in this world because it's not her world. At the end of the novel, she's restored to our world, and she gets a job as a chemist, and she's happy. And people came up to me afterwards who liked the novel and said, "Well, when are you going to write the next one?" And I was going, "Wait, you want me to have Jane wake up one morning and she's back in this world she managed finally at great cost to escape from?" I said, "I could not do that to her. She'd been such a fine character. She'd been so brave, and she never gave up. I was really quite fond of her. She's probably my favorite character I've ever written ever. So I could not do this to her." And then 15 years went by, and somebody hit me up for a story about dragons and said they particularly liked an iron dragon, and like in a novel. And I said, well, I don't have any ideas, but if I do, I'll write it. And I went home, and the next day, as will happen sometimes, I came up with exactly the kind of idea the editor was looking for. So I wrote a story, and which became the first chapter of the second book. And when I read the story, I looked at it and said, this is the first chapter of a book. So it was sort of the reverse of the first book. Will LaFay is a standard young country boy who's caught up in a war and is actually the secret king, of the land. Except, I'm not a monarchist. I'm a Democrat. I believe in this American system, and so I didn't think restoring a king to a country that was getting along fine without was a good idea. So I made up a list of everything that fantasy does, everything that happens in a fantasy novel, and said, let's turn it on its head. And I did. So at the end, Will has a place in his world, and it's not the place that the world has wanted him to have. So at that point, I had two novels, and basically thesis and antithesis. And I realized that when you've got one novel, you've got a book. When you have two novels, you have an unfinished trilogy. So from that point on, in the back of my head, I was always looking for that third book, so that, at night, the third shoe dropping. And eventually I found the right story to be the synthesis.
Okay. I love the concept of steam-powered dragons. I'm a huge fantasy nerd myself. I'm a huge sci-fi nerd too. So this is like, okay, robot dragons. I'm in. I'm sold. I want to know about designing this world, because I've read some of your other book, which we will be getting into later on, and you are such a great world builder. What went into designing the dragons?
Well, for the dragon itself, I went and visited as many locomotives as I could, and clambered around on them and took notes about what they smelled like and how they felt and how much room there was in them, and also did the same with fighter planes. So and then I just madly and unsystematically researched it as best I could. I found a book put out by the Baldwin Locomotive Works for their Eddystone plant, which had a map of the entire plant and then an explanation of what every building was and what happened in it. And I used that for the first novel, which begins in the Iron Dragon Works, so that when they're traveling around, also, I didn't spell it out. I didn't put maps in for the reader and so on. But whenever they go from point A to point C, they have to go through point B, because that's the way it was laid out on the map, so that it made a perfect kind of logic. You didn't have to spell this out for the reader. The reader trusts you. But I knew that I wasn't going to make a foolish blunder where the reader would say, wait a minute, that was located to the west last time. Now it's off to the east. Did not have that problem because I'd done a lot of research.
There's always that one reader who is going to catch your mistakes, no matter how small. There's always that one reader.
And there will always be mistakes. That's the one thing that I've learned, is that mistakes are like cockroaches. They want to be inside your book.
Was it hard for you, though, at first when you would make a mistake, when you would get something published, you'd see it and realize, oh, man, I totally got that thing wrong?
I have a strange good fortune that I'm a very slow writer. And when you're a slow writer, you're able to do an extra 20, 30, 40 drafts, which means that you tend to catch the mistakes. There will always be mistakes. And I just console myself. There's a classic definition of the novel. A novel is a work of fiction at least 60,000 words long, which has at least one mistake, which has something wrong with it. And that's true. you cannot write a perfect novel. You can write a perfect short story. I've written several, but you can't write a perfect novel.
That's good. That's fair. That's very fair. Take us into the world of the newest book in this series, The Iron Dragon's Mother. But no spoilers. We want to make sure that the world is spoiler free.
The Iron Dragon's Mother. Well, it begins. The first chapter is a slow, careful study of an old woman dying in a hospital.
Oh God!
I told this to Paul Park, and he smiled in that gentle way that he has, and he said, "You really know what the fans want, don't you, Michael?" But unfortunately, this was required by the nature of what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. Helen is dying in the hospital. She's a remarkable woman. She sees her life as having been a failure, but she's accomplished a great deal in her life, and she has an escape plan. She's escaped everything else in her life. She's going to escape death too. And at the end of the chapter, as she's executing her plan based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the dragons come, and she's inadvertently swept up in their wake and ends up inside the head of a young female dragon pilot. And from the second chapter on, it's all from the viewpoint of Caitlin, of Halcyon Merci, who's the pilot, and who discovers that she has this old woman inside her head, just like her mother, is there to give her good advice and to critique her taste in men 24/7.
Oh, goody. I want that.
So this novel is on one level is all about mothers. At one point I counted how many different types of mothers she had, and she had 7 different mothers. So she's blessed.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can just see it now. This grandmotherly voice nagging you constantly.
So I did one interesting thing in the novel. It occurred to me that I'd set these books inside a religious structure in which they worship the goddess, and the goddess is in charge. She really is there. So I decided, just as an experiment, I would make female the default setting. Like if you read a lot of 1950s science fiction, as I have, you notice that everybody's male unless there's a reason for that person to be female. And the result is there's a lot more men than there are women in their worlds, with some exceptions, of course. And so I decided to try it the other way around. And I gave myself a great deal of leeway. If there were 2 people going to have a conversation, it'd be useful to just say, he said, she said, he said, she said, instead of going back to their names all the time. I made it that. That was a good enough excuse. It didn't take much. And I found it was an interesting experiment. I found that it's harder to do than you would think. I was constantly writing a scene. I'd have a minor character, a bus driver, has a couple of lines, and I'd stop and say, why is that bus driver male? There are female bus drivers in this world. And then change it back. It really kind of gave me an insight into how it feels for women in our world, where the assumption is that you're male unless you're female, in which case you have to have an explanation for why you're female. So I decided to just flip that. And I liked how it came out. I think it came out, it has a nice feel to it.
I just love the whole concept of this world you've made here, because I want to ask you about characters too, because you definitely create some pretty interesting characters. But how do you make your characters matter?
Again, I think this comes from writing very slowly. I spend a lot of time with the characters. I really care about them. I make sure that they have their own voice. They're not just there to move the plot along. So even if they are just there to move the plot along, they have their own concerns, and I'm aware of that. And that's it essentially. I think that works for pretty much all writing.
Do you plan your books out, or do you kind of go by the seat of your pants?
I have kind of a hybrid method.
Okay.
I'll come up with an idea, and I'll come up with the opening line, and I'll write that down, and then I'll work at creating the world. I'll create characters, I'll create things, I'll create ideas. I might create names and such, and I keep making notes, but I don't write anything. Maybe a page or 2. but I don't really sit down and write seriously until I've figured out how it's going to end. And then when I know how it's going to end, and I usually know what the last line of the novel is, I aim right at that. Now, so that all the novel is driving toward that point. And if you can write this way, that actually has two advantages. One of which is that when you reach the ending, no matter, it's going to sound surprising, because as knowing how the reader is receiving this, I can mislead the reader. I can misdirect their expectations. So the ending will come as a surprise. At the same time, when you reach that, the fact that the entire novel has been aiming at that point will feel inevitable. And if you can reach an ending that's both inevitable and a surprise, then that's a satisfying ending as far as I'm concerned.
You know, I've never heard someone describe their writing style like that.
When I know the ending, I can start writing. And in the writing, I'm winging it. I'm where the reader is. I'm trying to figure out what's going on, and I'm making sure that it is headed in that direction. But I do not know what comes between here and the end, except that it must all make sense by the time it gets to the end. Sometimes in the last couple of chapters, you realize that there's a great deal of meaning that has to be slipped into those last chapters. And it's a race to see if you can get said everything that has to be said before the story actually ends.
Have you ever had to change an ending because in the process of writing the book, you found that something else worked better to, wrap things up?
For some short stories I have. I had a short story. I submitted it to Ellen Datlow, and she rejected it. And she said that, as a horror editor, that she knew how it was going to end. It didn't surprise her. And I went, oh, it hadn't occurred to me the story was a horror story. And I said, oh, of course it is. And of course Ellen is right. So I came up with, I think, a much better ending. And then I sold it to the next editor that I submitted it to. So I'm actually kind of anxious for it to come out so that I can find out if Ellen thinks this version is any better or not, because I do respect her opinion. And I'm grateful to her for improving the story.
You must know everyone in the publishing world, right? Because you've been in so many magazines, and you've been doing this for so long. When it comes to publishing your stuff, selling your work, are you usually on good terms with the people who run the magazines and the companies, because you just have been doing this for so long?
Oh, I am on good terms with them. It's really because they're mostly pretty good people. Mm-hmm. they the thing about science fiction publishing is it used to be, it's changed now, but it used to be that science fiction was a profitable corner of publishing that wasn't very prestigious to its editors. So if you had a position open, it was a little difficult to fill. All the people who've spent all their college years, they come out, they want to edit John Updike, or Virginia Woolf, and they don't particularly want to be working in mystery or science fiction or romance. But in science fiction, we have these editors who come in wanting to work in science fiction and not wanting to promote it away from it to an area of literature that they may not be as fond of. So when people are there working as editors in science fiction because they love science fiction, these people are pretty easy to get along with when you feel the same way about it. Now, mind you, financially, well, that's why I have an agent.
Always important. Always
Yes.
important. Have you always had an agent, or is this more like a recent development in your career?
Oh, people ask me how you get an agent. I have to tell them I don't know, because what happened to me was I had shown a story to Gardner Dozois. I had submitted it it was a mystery story, which has never been published, but I had submitted it to Alfred Hitchcock's and to Ellery Queen, and they both rejected it. And that used up all the markets that took non-agented material. So Gardner offered to ask his agent, Virginia Kidd, if she would be willing to handle this story. And she said she'd look at it. I sent it to her, and she wrote me back a letter saying, "Congratulations on your agent now." So
awesome.
So I was unpublished, and I had an agent. And 3-4 years later, 5 years later, she sent me a contract to sign.
Now, is she still your agent?
Well, Virginia died a while back.
Oh, jeez.
So I'm working on my second and a half agent. Martha Millard is a lovely woman, a very good agent, and she recently retired. So now I'm with the Sterling Lord Literaristic, and they're covering me. So
okay,
that's where I am.
Nice. Now, you mentioned earlier about the change in the industry. How has the change hit your career?
It hasn't much until recently. Mm-hmm. Basically, the thing to keep in mind is that the industry has a collapse every 15 years or so. Mm-hmm. I've seen it collapse 2-3 times, where it gets in a desperate situation and nobody can make a living at it. And then somehow we soldier on and things get better. This looks like a kind of a strange sort of collapse that's happening right now. I hear a lot of things from writers who are moving into self-publishing, not because they want to take on the extra work, but because they're having a hard time with the industry. Certainly, the whole publishing, the reviewing rules have changed. The Iron Dragon's Daughter had, I think, only 6 reviews. They were all places like the Wall Street Journal and Publishers Weekly and so on. They were all really great places, and they were all rave reviews. But then all the little review places, none of them. I think there's been a change. I have no idea what to do about that, but I still appear to be viable. So just keeping on writing.
One thing that I've seen also is that you'll see a lot of indie writers too. You know, they want to get some kind of, response to their work, and that can sometimes be definitely a struggle, especially if you're, just kind of starting out, or if you're kind of like a small scale individual.
I always tell people, if you're going to be an indie writer, if you're going to publish yourself, then you're going to have to be a business person as well as a writer, and you're going to have. And I tell them, and they usually ignore this part. I tell them, write up a business plan. You can probably get, I think there used to be, I think there may still be, small business administration programs that would connect you with a retired business person that just wants to do good and who can advise you. I would say, see if you can find a retired businessman to look at your business plan. And if you don't know what a business plan is, then you should learn first. But the main thing is that you should go and you should be asking these questions from people who have succeeded in indie publishing. And what they're going to tell you is all going to be about the practicalities of it. I can't advise people on how to do that. I don't really know. I've talked to people who do. I respect the hell out of them. My goodness, they put in a lot of work above and beyond writing, which is a full-time job in and of itself.
Exactly. If you're going to do it yourself, you've got to do it all yourself.
Yeah. I also encourage people not to simply throw lots of money at it. Mm-hmm. To hire an editor, to hire a publicist, to hire this, to hire that. I've known people who spent an enormous amount on those things and got nothing. Mm-hmm. And it worries me for new writers, because new writers can be easily discouraged by a streak of, let's say, 5 years of absolute silence on the artistic front, accompanied by a loss of all the free money that they have. And just because they can't make it as an indie writer does not mean that does not necessarily mean that they're not good writers. Okay. They could simply be terrible business people.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so much to learn too if you want to do it yourself. You got to be good at promotion. You got to be good at writing your own press releases. You got to be good at connecting with the media. You got to be good just putting yourself out there. And for some writers, if they tend to be very introverted, this can be a insurmountable obstacle.
I had a young writer told me she'd just published her first novel. And I said, "Oh, that's great." She said, "Now how do I get people to know it exists?" Find out the people who really do know. Make sure that they're people who have succeeded rather than they're simply telling you they succeeded. And then listen to them with care and respect.
Exactly. Take notes. Take lessons, because there's a lot to gain from their experience.
Also, I'd say don't give up on the possibility of just selling your book to a mainstream publisher. People still do that. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes those books go on to become bestsellers.
Yeah, so. Exactly. You just never know where it's going to go. You have another new book out, which I have read some of, and I'm absolutely hooked on it. This is City Under the Stars. This was also a collaboration project with Gardner Dozois, who you mentioned earlier. And this is another thing that kind of came about from another work you did many years ago. Gardner, I also read, unfortunately, has passed away. And this was sort of almost like a tribute to the work you two did together. I'm curious how you met in the first place.
Oh, goodness. Well, I came to Philadelphia when I was 25. And I had no reason for it. I had no reason to be anywhere else. So I came here. I had $50 in my pocket, packets a day cigarette habit, and a friend who was willing to put me up on his couch for a week. So I was young. I was bohemian. I was penniless. I got terrible temporary jobs. I sold my blood. I typed turn papers for $1 a day. I wrote them for like $1 a page. I wrote them for something like $2 a page. I was living very, very street level. And so you meet people. And I met him through a friend of a friend. He was a little wary of me because he was a published writer. He had this gravitas of age. He was published. He was among science fiction insiders. He was universally acknowledged to be the best writer nobody had ever heard of. He was very impressive. Oh, actually, even physically. Gardner was a very tall man, 6 foot something, very, very heavy. He wore blue jeans, had a black Stetson cowboy hat, long, straight blonde hair, a little blonde beard, a black T-shirt that said in white letters, "Prophet of Doom." You could see him from a mile away. So he was a little wary of me because he knew I was gonna be a writer, and he just kept being afraid that I was going to try to get him to read my awful fiction. And I didn't for years. And then finally, after about 5 years, he said, "Michael, let me read your awful fiction." I did. I gave him a story that I was working on. And one night, Jack Dan had come into town. Gardner invited me over to his tiny little cat-infested apartment. They took the story apart and they showed me how to rewrite it to turn it into a real story. It was like God had reached down out of the sky and flicked a switch in my head. And I was a writer, and I knew it. And from that moment on, I could always write fiction. It didn't get any easier, but the thing that I had all this trouble writing would turn into a real story. And it's like, I got it. So I owe him everything. And when I first met him, there was, among his friends, there was a piece of writing he'd done, which is legend. It was referred to as the Digger novel. He had started to write a novel, which began with a long description of a man shoveling coal into a hole. And they said, it's the most gripping, imaginable description of a man shoveling coal into a hole. And I really wanted to read it. It was nothing I could ask to read. I'd known him for, 12 years. And I was visiting him, and it was raining, and Susan's, his wife-to-be, Susan Casper, asked him to go out to the corner to get cigarettes. So he went to the closet, he got his coat, and he came back with this cardboard box with a manuscript in it and dumped it in my lap and said, "Here, Michael, there's a Digger novel. You can read it while I'm away." And then he went to the corner, bought some cigarettes, came back, took back the novel and put it in the closet. And I'd read 3 or 4 pages by then. Long story short, finally, we decided to write it to write it as a novella. It came out. It was a really beautiful story called The City of God, and it had a very dark ending. But over the years, after we published it, every now and then we talk about it. We came up with this plan. We were going to write 2 more novellas: The City of Angels and The City of Men, and then we put the 3 of them together, and it would be a novel. He was a busy man. I mean, anybody with 15 Hugos for best editor is going to not have a lot of free time. And I was busy also. We kept not writing it. And then let's say 3 years ago, it caught fire again. And Gardner and I started writing The City of Angels, the second novella. And we were halfway through that story when he died quite unexpectedly of an acquired disease in the hospital. When he died, Marianne said, "You'd better finish this thing fast." And I said, "You're right." Because I wanted this as a memorial to Gardner. So I took the second, I took the second novella. I threw away a lot of the plot we were going to have in that. And I took the ending that Gardner had. Gardner had an ending for the entire novel, which was all I knew about what the third novella would like, which is how it would end. And it was a happy ending. It was a happy ending for everybody, for the main character, for the world, for everybody. Gardner was one of the bleakest writers ever to hit science fiction. I would tell people this, they had a happy ending, and they would laugh. But it wasn't a laugh of belief. I said, no, really, a happy ending. So I finished it. I wrote it. I wrote the ending he would have written for the novel. I wrote it in as much as his voice as I could. I put the two halves together. I did a final draft so they'd be in the same voice and broke it into chapters. So it wouldn't be like two novellas. It would be like one story that goes through to the end. And so this is my gift to him. That's his fourth novel. He had one solo novel, Strangers, which is an astonishing novel. He had one potboiler called Nightmare Blue, written with George L. Geffinger. He had one story, had one novel with George R.R. Martin and Tony Daniels. And so this is his final one. Gardner would have loved to have written more novels with a difficult form for him. This is like a memorial to him. It's a last novel, and it's a happy ending. It ends on a glad note.
Which is good because it does not start on a glad note. It is the bleakest. I was reading the beginning, I was like, this is depressing as crap. I hope it gets better because it can't get much worse.
Oh, that's in fact, you begin with the seeing him shoveling coal in a hole, and you get to watch his life destroyed, his soul destroyed, to the point where there's no place you can go from there, and then it gets worse. And quite frankly, through the first novella and the first three quarters, through almost all the second novella, almost all the way back up to the final chapter. Basically, it just keeps getting worse. My wife was reading this as I was finishing it up, and she got to like one chapter away. She said, "There is no way this ends well." And I'm going, "No, a happy ending," and it is. It does. And I wanted people to know Gardner had a happy ending. I thought that he deserved a happy ending. Mm-hmm. So no, I want them to remember him on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just love like the description of this world. Like there's so much detail in this, not just from the main character Hansen, but just everything about it. That the people around him, you craft them so wonderfully. Like you and Gardner, it's just like I can picture all of them, picture what they look like, how they act, how they move. It's such a wonderful description of them.
Oh, it's just Gardner was such a wonderful, wonderful writer. He spent so much time as an editor and was so successful at it. People tend to forget that. But when he was writing full time and in astonishing poverty, people like Joe Haldeman and George R.R. Martin were in awe of him. Like, he's the person that George Martin thought, no, I could never be that good.
Wow.
Yes. So he's an astonishingly good writer. I encourage everybody to look up his work.
What is next for you, Michael? You've got these books out. What's in the near future for you?
Well, right now, I'm writing a lot of short fiction. I am a little more than halfway through a series of stories that is called the Mongolian Wizard series that's been running on Tor.com. Basically, it's a Rortenian fantasy. It's an alternate past Europe where there are wizards and such, and magic. And there is a world war that is fought through the course of, it's going to be 21 stories that will tell the story of the entire war, all through the viewpoint of a young Prussian officer named named Ritter. He's an interesting character. He's extremely competent. He believes he's a good guy, and he's not entirely right about that last part. And I've got a lot of other stories coming out, and I'm writing a lot more. And pretty soon, maybe this week, maybe next month, I have to decide what my next novel is. I've got a list of 6 possibilities. I've got to sit down and see which one is the one that's going to be the most rewarding artistically to work on.
Oh my God, dude, I can't wait. I cannot wait. Michael, it has been such an awesome pleasure talking to you. I appreciate you taking the time. But for the folks at home who want to check out your work, what's the best place to go? Where can they go to learn more about you?
To learn about me? Goodness, I don't really care about me.
Oh.
For my work, if you like science fiction, the best place to start is with a novel called Stations of the Tide. And if you like fantasy, the best place to start is with The Iron Dragon's Daughter or The Iron Dragon's Mother, either one. I'd encourage people to look one of them up. My work is all around.
Excellent. Michael, thank you again. I really appreciate this. All right, folks, that brings this episode to a close. Thanks to Michael for joining me, and you, the listeners, for checking out every episode. Follow me on Facebook under Citywide Blackout, Twitter, Instagram, Citywide Max, and check out citywideblackout.blogspot.com. You can hear the show on Spotify, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, and every Saturday at 10 p.m. on Boston Free Radio. As always, keep those ears open.